If you're not familiar with something called shredded wheat, it is basically hay. And if you're a human being, you may not be that fond of consuming hay the way horses are. So there is now something called frosted mini wheats. Basically, what happened is Kellogg's realized that people would eat these small packets of hay if they were drenched in sugar to the tune of about 11 grams per serving and packaged in brightly colored boxes, and now it's a best-selling cereal. The point is to sugarcoat something that people wouldn't want to eat. Now, what interests me is a cereal that doesn't have to be sugar-coated. I happen to be a huge fan of Cheerios, which are tasty and nutritious and don't need to be perked up with anything, really. They can even be eaten without milk. The perfect cereal as far as I'm concerned. I've loved it for years. And sugarcoating is something worth talking about, in fact. That's what I want to talk about today. I'm not the first one. One of the first really popular podcasts about 10 years ago was called Cereal. I never listened to it, but I assume it's about frosted mini wheats and Cheerios and so on. But because this podcast is about how we teach and raise kids, you've probably figured out that I'm using the term sugarcoating figuratively rather than literally. I'm Alfie Kohn, and you're listening to Kohn's Zone. Sugarcoating is a term that appears in two very important education books, the older and more famous of which I will get back to in a few minutes. The lesser-known one is a book called Moral Children, Moral Classrooms. It was written by the late Rheta DeVries and her colleague Betty Zahn. Rheta DeVries was one of three women in the United States who were really responsible for turning Jean Piaget's work on child development into something quite practical and meaningful in the field of education. The other two were her sometimes colleague Constance Connie Camille, Kamii, who is must-reading if you have any interest in how children learn mathematics, and Eleanor Duckworth of Harvard University. Anyway, Rheta and Betty created this book specifically about very young children, in which they took the Piagetian concept. By the way, both DeVries and Camille had studied personally with Piaget. I think Eleanor Duckworth did too, briefly. And talked about Piaget's idea about relationships between adults and kids. Piaget said there are basically two kinds of relationships. There's those that are geared to autonomy and those geared to heteronomy. So an autonomous relationship is one that's based on mutual respect and cooperation, the goal being to promote independent thinking and moral growth in children. The opposite, a heteronomous relationship, is basically about demanding that the child defer to authority. So DeVries and Zahn in their books said the latter approach, the heteronomous approach to relationships with kids, can manifest itself in a range of ways from overtly hostile and punitive to, wait for it, sugar-coated control. So the first one is something that we are all familiar with, the idea of overtly coercing children by threatening them, by saying to them, in effect, do this, or here's how I'm going to make you suffer, is pretty clear-cut, and it's pretty obvious that if I do that to you, I'm trying to control you. And it doesn't matter if I use a euphemism like time out instead of forcible isolation of young children, or more generally, if we call punishment consequences even insert the modifier logical to make us feel better about making kids feel terrible. It's still punishment. It's still deliberately trying to make children unhappy in the hopes that that will improve their future behavior. But if instead of saying, do this, or here's what I'm going to do to you, I say to them, do this and you'll get that. If instead of threatening a punishment, I dangle a reward in front of them, we tend to feel better about that and assume it's a very different state of affairs. But it isn't. DeVries and Zahn, like a lot of other people, have pointed out, it's still an instrument of manipulation. As I like to put it, it's still a way of doing to instead of working with. What we're doing is sugarcoating control to make it seem more palatable. If not for the kid who may see through this, then at least to us, so we can feel better about ourselves. So DeVries and Zahn in their books said, first of all, we should acknowledge what's going on. It's still hay under all that sweetener of saying, good job. I really like the way you're ... Or, dangling stickers or gold stars or sweet foods or grades or money or, whatever it is. We should acknowledge that this is still heteronymous, it's still doing to, it's still about manipulation and control. And second, they said we should basically reject that. We should move past any flavor of control in favor of something that is genuinely, authentically about supporting their autonomy. The second book that used that came out even earlier, much earlier. How about 1902? Turn of the last century. It was John Dewey's book, The Child and the Curriculum. And he pointed out that a curriculum that's based on students' questions, one that connects with their experiences, has, quote, an inherent attracting power. Unfortunately, it's really hard to teach that way. Not impossible, but pretty difficult to do something that's authentically engaging, really appealing. It means that the adult has to create a classroom where kids are, and this is another of my favorite phrases from Dewey, where kids are the center of gravity in the classroom. Isn't that lovely? Whereas Dewey pointed out, in the great majority of classrooms, the center of gravity is anywhere and anything but the kids. It's in the teacher, it's in the administrators who tell the teachers what to do, it's in the curriculum that was devised by distant authorities, or at least people who've never met the children. But to have kids be the center of gravity in the classroom where the learning takes place is a very different thing. And that's the kind of curriculum you don't need to sugarcoat. What's easier, though, is to take like a prefabricated lesson, may very well not be relevant to or meaningful to the students. And now I'm going to quote Dewey again. And then by trick of method, to arouse interest, to make it interesting, to cover it with sugarcoating, to conceal its barrenness by intermediate and unrelated material. This is, again from 1902, an uncanny anticipation of what's called gamification, or more broadly, the entire field of ed tech, which is basically about sugarcoating, about adding, to switch metaphors, bells and whistles, to take stuff that most kids understandably have very little interest in because it's basically about cramming forgettable facts into short-term memory or making them rehearse a series of skills devoid of context or apparent purpose, and to make it artificially seem appealing. In the case of gamification, it's done by adding the nomenclature and the stock and trade of video games, points and levels and contests and stuff like that to get kids to master a bunch of facts. And that's not true only, of course, of digital stuff that's added to education, like ed tech stuff that requires devices and software and so on. I mean, I'm old enough to remember those perky textbook sidebars, like, here's a point you can use, or here's something to take the dreariness of the main corporate written textbook and make it seem relevant to your life and kind of flashy or sexy. Or it's the same thing with those contrived word problems in math, to kind of simulate relevance for what is basically just an exercise in mechanically applying formulas and algorithms. Or maybe you've seen classrooms where one of my kids was in such a classroom where the test prep session the day before the big test, they had a game, which was, in this case, a TV game show simulation where the kids competed against each other to cram bits of useless knowledge into their memory to try to make it fun. This way, the teacher doesn't have to question whether what's being taught is at all meaningful or important, whether it involves any understanding as opposed to just rote recall, doesn't have to question the method of the teaching, the pedagogy the rest of the time, yet just sugarcoat it. And that's what frosted mini-wheats are all about. You take the shredded wheat and you try to make it palatable. But I'm a fan of Cheerios, the stuff you don't have to sugarcoat in the first place. So for Deweyans, what that looks like is a kind of curriculum where you're helping students to think in increasingly sophisticated ways about the world that they actually live in. The curriculum is crafted around their real-life experiences. It taps and takes its cue from their questions about the world and about themselves. It feeds into curiosity. A Deweyan curriculum is based on problems and projects and questions rather than facts and skills and separate disciplines. And it's problems kids want to explore, and they do so often by way of interdisciplinary projects that they themselves help to design. A lot of Dewey's writings basically get down to saying, when you have that kind of authentically engaging, project-based curriculum, you don't need to add sugar. And so, to sum up here, for DeVries and Zahn, who are basically channeling Jean Piaget, don't sugarcoat the control by calling it positive reinforcement. Work with kids in order to support their moral and social development. And for Dewey, don't sugarcoat the lessons to disguise their lack of value. Instead, you should work with kids to craft learner-centered education that supports their intellectual development. And by the way, keeps alive their enthusiasm, their curiosity. But both Dewey and Piaget and their respective acolytes said, in effect, expect resistance. People are going to insist that rewards are different than punishment and much better. People are going to resist the idea that carrots are just as much about control and heteronomy. Doing autonomy support is tricky, it's challenging, especially for adults who are used to relying on power and modeling it for kids. In the intellectual realm, we've got topics that I will talk about in later episodes of this podcast about the whole standards and testing system where the expectations and outcomes are imposed by authorities, imposed on students, and to some extent imposed on teachers, enforced by exams to ensure accountability. It's based on a fundamentally behaviorist model, which is long after the death of Boris Frederick Skinner, behaviorism lives on in scripted curriculum and reducing children and their learning to data, the use of grades and rubrics and competency-based or proficiency-based approaches to instruction, reading incentives, standardized assessments. I could go on. And in fact, in this podcast, I will go on. Because the learning isn't personal, an entire industry stands ready to profit from artificially personalizing it. And you may have even heard of chilling phrases like mass customized learning. If the learning is authentically personal, you don't have to artificially personalize it. Just like if the learning is meaningful and created in part from students' questions, you don't have to sugarcoat it. So if the point of departure is the shredded wheat of lectures and worksheets and quizzes and homework and tests and grades, yeah, I understand. It's tempting to add a spoonful of sugar to help it go down a little easier. The real challenge is to take our cue from Dewey to start from a different point of departure, which is the authentically engaging curriculum. The first step is to realize what we've been doing all along. The sugarcoating metaphor really can be revelatory. It induces us to jump up and exclaim, "Hey! It's still just, hey!"